after the Soviet Union, all these Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, these became the states of the former Soviet Union. So Afghanistan shared boundaries with the three former Soviet republics of Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. And in the 1950s, after the death of the Stalin, in 1953, Stalin died, and he was succeeded by Khrushchev and Bulganin. These are the two Soviet Communist Party members. They've opened the doors for the Soviet Union from the time of the Stalin. In their first country that they went to was in the 1955-56 to Afghanistan, and they started giving some sort of financial aid and military aid to Afghanistan. And that was really a big thing in those days, because this is the beginning, it's almost the early stages of the Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union, between the United States at the head of the independent world, or free world, and the Soviet bloc of the time. So then the second step by these two people, Khrushchev and Bulganin in Russia, now they went to Egypt and established a relationship with Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. And both of these countries received weapons from the Soviet Union in the 1956-57. After that, there was the sort of friendship between Afghanistan and the Soviet Union, which established in the 1950s. And just go fast forward, then we come to the 1970s. In the 1978, a coup took place in Afghanistan. The coup was mostly managed by a pro-Soviet and Soviet-trained military officers in Afghanistan. It was in 1978. And a communist party in Afghanistan, which used to be called the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. It was a very pro-Soviet, pro-Kremlin communist party in Afghanistan, and they took charge and control of the government in Afghanistan in 1978. So toward the end in 1979, this government in Afghanistan, which was a pro-Soviet government in Afghanistan, came as a result of a military coup and was collapsing. So the Soviet Union at the time, Brezhnev was the chief of the Politburo at that time. They made the decision to invade Afghanistan. So the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, was December 29, 1979. So they invaded Afghanistan with a very small military, probably about 12,000 or 13,000. So that was a big mistake that they made. They should have come with a massive force. So they came with the 12,000, mostly KGB and other troops. So what happened, when this happened, the military defected from Afghanistan. Then the Soviet Union, 15,000 more troops. It was just bleeding and sort of hemorrhaging. So the Soviet Union toward the end, after 10 years, so the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979. And the Soviet troops were in Afghanistan until February of 1989. So almost 10 full years the Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan and bombarded and carpet bombed, but they did not succeed. So toward the end they decided to abandon Afghanistan. So the Soviet Union started with 12,000 troops in Afghanistan, and eventually at the end of their campaign in Afghanistan they had about 125,000 troops in Afghanistan, after giving almost 1,500 deaths and literally 40,000 wounded, and in the process they killed about 1.2 million Afghans, and 6 million Afghans became refugees in Pakistan and Iran, and about 1 million Afghans became crippled. Excuse me. So it was very devastating campaign by the Soviet Union. It cost them dearly in terms of human lives and money. And at the same time, so Afghanistan was totally, utterly destroyed. Then the Soviet left. When the Soviet Union troops were in Afghanistan, the Afghan resistance forces, which were called Mujahideen, they were supported by the United States, by the Europeans, by the Arab countries, the Muslim world. So they all were supporting the Afghan resistance against the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union failed in its campaign in Afghanistan, left, but Afghanistan was destroyed. When they left Afghanistan, somehow the West also forgot about Afghanistan. The United States and the Arab countries of the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, they also, which were supporting the resistance against Afghanistan, they abandoned too. So a vacuum was created. To that vacuum stepped in groups like Taliban, and later we see that Al-Qaeda went to Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden, he had his camps in Afghanistan. So what happened? Does the Soviet Union abandon Afghanistan? And other countries and the world community forgot about Afghanistan, so this big, huge vacuum was created, and that vacuum was filled by these international terrorist groups. Especially Al-Qaeda was there. And then comes the September the 11th. After September, so the consequences of the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan was that it created this Jihadi groups. The first one being the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, then later the Taliban. Al-Qaeda succeeded too. So somehow one can say that these were the indirect consequences of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And then after September the 11th, so the United States decided to go and invade Afghanistan. So that was in September the 11th, 2001. The two Twin Towers were hit by two planes which were hijacked by Al-Qaeda operatives. And one of them hit the Pentagon, and the fourth one crashed in Pennsylvania. So in the George Bush administration, they made the decision to go and attack Afghanistan, and they removed the Taliban and Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan. So they ousted them from Afghanistan, but they did not destroy them, did not defeat them. So they went to Pakistan and set their tents and camps there. So from there now so Al-Qaeda is still in Afghanistan. About a few years ago, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the second to Osama bin Laden, is still in Pakistan. So he is now in charge of the Al-Qaeda. So that's that situation. And the American forces went to Iraq. And the assets and the intelligence, they were all transferred from Afghanistan. But the attention of focus from Afghanistan was now focused on Iraq. So the Afghanistan job was half done. Americans got bogged down in Iraq. So when the Americans went to Iraq, and Iraq did not have Al-Qaeda. So then there was, in 2003, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was formed under the leadership of one of the persons by the name of Musab al-Zarqawi. He was a Jordanian. He was killed by American bombardment. And then this mantle was taken now. So this Islamic State of Iraq was born when Americans were in Iraq. So Islamic State of Iraq later evolved into Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. So what happened? The consequences of the Soviet Union contributed to the creation of Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and the United States occupation of Iraq resulted into Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And later in Syria, Bashar al-Assad, who is a Shia, it's Alawite Shia, they are the minority, so they are suppressing the majority of the Sunnis in Syria. So the Shia minority is suppressing the Sunnis in Syria, and in Iraq, the Shia majority is suppressing the Sunni minority. So these two Sunni minority in Iraq and Sunni majority in Syria combined their forces, and the result was the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, which is the ISIL, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. So in some ways, just as the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan contributed to the promotion of Taliban and Al-Qaeda and Mujahideen and these Jihadi groups, and the United States invasion of Iraq somehow directly or indirectly contributed to the success of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then later Islamic State in Iraq and today's Syria.